Chapter 7, page 108, Lord of the Flies. Ralph looked at the sun critically. Early evening after tea time, at any rate. I don't remember this cliff, said Jack, crestfallen. So this must be a bit of the coast I missed. Ralph nodded. Let me think. By now, Ralph had no self-consciousness in public thinking. No self-consciousness in public thinking. But would treat the day's decisions as though he were playing chess. The only trouble is that he would never be a very good chess player. He thought of the little ones and Piggy. Vividly, he imagined Piggy by himself, huddled in the shelter that was silent except for the sounds of nightmare. We can't leave the little ones alone with Piggy. Not all night. The other boys said nothing but stood round watching him. If we went back, we should take hours. Jack cleared his throat and spoke in a queer, tight voice. We mustn't let anything happen to Piggy, must we? Ralph tapped his teeth with the dirty point of Eric's spear. If we go across, he glanced around him, someone got to go across the island and tell Piggy we'll be back after dark. Bill spoke, unbelieving. Through the forest by himself? Now? We can't spare more than one. Simon pushed his way to Ralph's elbow. I'll go if you like. I don't mind, honestly. Before Ralph had time to reply, he smiled quickly, turned and climbed into the forest. Ralph looked back at Jack, seeing him infuriatingly for the first time. Jack, that time you went the whole way to the Castle Rock? Jack glowered. Yes. You came along part of this shore below the mountain. Beyond there? Yes. And then? I found a pig run. It went for miles. So the pig run must be somewhere in there. Ralph nodded. He pointed at the forest. Everybody agreed, sagely. All right then. We'll smash a way through till we find the pig run. He took a step and halted. Wait a minute, though. Where does the pig run go to? The mountain, said Jack. I told you. He sneered. Don't you want to go to the mountain? Ralph sighed, sensing the rising antagonism, understanding that this was how Jack felt as soon as he ceased to lead. I was thinking of the light. We'll be stumbling about. We were going to look for the beast. There won't be enough light. I don't mind going, said Jack hotly. I'll go when we get there, won't you? Would you rather go back to the shelter and tell Piggy? Now it was Ralph's turn to flush, but he spoke despairingly, out of the new understanding that Piggy had given him. Why do you hate me? He asked Jack. The boys stirred uneasily, as though something indecent had been said. The silence lengthened. Jack, still hot and hurt, turned away first. Ralph, still hot and hurt, turned away first. Come on. He led the way and set himself as by right to hack at the tangles. Jack brought up the rear, displaced and brooding. The pig track was a dark tunnel, for the sun was sliding quickly toward the edge of the world, and in the forest shadows were never far to seek. The track was broad and beaten, and they ran along at swift trot. Then the roof of the leaves broke up, and they halted, breathing quickly, looking at a few stars that pricked round the head of the mountain. There you are. The boys peered at each other doubtfully. Ralph made a decision. We'll go straight across to the platform and climb tomorrow. They murmured agreement, but Jack was standing by his shoulder. If you're frightened, of course. Ralph turned on him. Who went first on the Castle Rock? I went too, and that was daylight. All right, who wants to climb the mountain now? Silence was the only answer. Sam and Eric. What about you? We ought to go and tell Piggy. Yeah, tell Piggy that. But Simon went. We ought to tell Piggy in case. Robert? Bill? They were going straight back to the platform now. Not, of course, that they were afraid, but tired. Ralph turned back to Jack. You see? I'm going up the mountain. The words came from Jack viciously, as though it were a curse. He looked at Ralph, his thin body tense, his spear held as if he threatened him. I'm going up the mountain to look for the beast now. Then the supreme sting, the casual, bitter word, coming? At that word, the other boys forgot their urge to be gone and turned back to sample this fresh rub of the two spirits in the dark. The word was too good, too bitter, too successfully daunting to be repeated. It took Ralph at low water when his nerve was relaxed for the return to the shelter and the still, friendly waters of the lagoon. I don't mind. Astonished, he heard his voice come out, cool and casual, so that the bitterness of Jack's taunt felt powerless. If you don't mind, of course. Oh, not at all. Jack took a step. Well then. Side by side, watched by silent boys, the two started up the mountain. Ralph stopped. We're silly. Why should only two go? If we find anything, two won't be enough. There came the sound of boys scuttling away astonishingly. A dark figure moved against the tide. Roger? Yeah? That's 3 then. Once more they set out to climb the slope of the mountain. The darkness seemed to flow round them like a tide. Jack, who had said nothing, began to choke and cough, and a gust of wind set all 3 spluttering. Ralph's eyes were blinded with tears. Ashes! We're on the edge of the burnt patch! Their footsteps and the occasional breeze were stirring up small devils of dust. Now that they stopped again, Ralph had time while he coughed to remember how silly they were. If there was no beast, and almost certainly there was no beast, in that case, well and good. But if there was something waiting on top of the mountain, what was the use of 3 of them, handicapped by the darkness and carrying only sticks? We're being fools. Out of the darkness came the answer. Windy. Irritably, Ralph shook himself. This was all Jack's fault. Course I am, but we're still being fools. If you don't want to go on, said the voice sarcastically, I'll go up by myself. Ralph heard the mockery and hated Jack. The sting of ashes in his eyes, tiredness, fear, enraged him. Go on then, we'll wait here. There was silence. Why don't you go? Are you frightened? A stain in the darkness, a stain that was Jack, detached itself and began to draw away. All right, so long. The stain vanished. Ooh, so Jack's a stain. Ralph, the stain vanished, another took its place. Ralph felt his knees against something hard and rocked a charred trunk that was edgy to the touch. He felt the sharp cinders that had been bark pushed against the back of his knee and knew that Roger had sat down. He felt with his hands and lowered himself beside Roger. While the trunk rocked among invisible ashes, Roger, uncommunicative by nature, said nothing. He offered no opinion on the beast, nor told Ralph why he had chosen to come on this mad expedition. He simply sat and rocked the trunks gently. Ralph noticed a rapid and infuriating tapping noise and realized that Roger was banging his silly wooden stick against something. So they sat, the rocking, tapping, impervious Roger and Ralph, fuming. Round them, the close sky was loaded with stars, save where the mountain punched up a hole of blackness. There was a slithering noise high above them, the sound of something taking giant and dangerous strides on rock or ash. Then Jack found them and was shivering and croaking in a voice they could just recognize as his. I saw a thing up on top. They heard him blunder against the trunk, which rocked violently. He lay silent for a moment, then muttered, Keep a good lookout. It may be following. A shower of ash pattered round them. Jack sat up. I saw a thing bulge on the mountain. You only imagined it, said Ralph shakily. Because nothing would bulge, not any sort of creature. Ralph spoke. They jumped, for they had forgotten him. A frog! Jack giggled and shuddered. Some frog. There was a noise, too, a kind of plop noise. Then the thing bulged. Ralph surprised himself, not so much by the quality of his voice, which was even, but by the bravado of his intention. We'll go up and look. For the first time since he had first known Jack, Ralph could feel him hesitate. Now? His voice spoke for him. Of course. He got off the trunk and led the way across the clinking cinders, up into the dark, and the others followed. Now that his physical voice was silent, the inner voice of reason, and other voices too, made themselves heard. Piggy was calling him a kid. Another voice told him not to be a fool, and the darkness and desperate enterprise gave the night a kind of dentist chair unreality. I love that metaphor. Gave the night a dentist chair unreality. As they came to the last slope, Jack and Roger drew near. Changed from the ink stains to distinguishable figures, by common consent they stopped and crouched together. Behind them, on the horizon, was a patch of lighter sky where in a moment the moon would rise. The wind roared once in the forest and pushed their rags against them. Ralph stirred. Come on! They crept forward, Roger lagging a little. Jack and Ralph turned the shoulder of the mountain together. The glittering lengths of the lagoon lay below them, and beyond that a long white smudge that was the reef. Roger joined them. Jack whispered, Let's creep forward on hands and knees. Maybe it's asleep. Roger and Ralph moved on, this time leaving Jack in the rear. For all his brave words, they came to the flat top where the rock was hard to hands and knees. A creature that bulged? Ralph put his hand in the cold, soft ashes of the fire, smothered a cry. His hand and shoulder were twitching from the unlooked-for contact. Green lights of nausea appeared for a moment and ate into the darkness. Roger lay behind him, and Jack's mouth was at his ear. Over there, where there used to be a gap in the rock, a sort of hump, see? Ashes blew into Ralph's face from the dead fire. He could not see the gap or anything else because the green lights of nausea, I've never heard that, were opening again and growing, and the top of the mountain was sliding sideways. Once more from a distance, he heard Jack's whisper, "Scared?" Not scared so much as paralyzed, hung up here, immovable, on the top of a diminishing, moving mountain. Jack slid away from him. Roger bumped, fumbled with a hiss of breath, and passed onwards. He heard them whispering, "Can you see anything?" "There!" In front of them, only 3 or 4 yards away, was a rock-like hump where no rock should be. Ralph could hear a tiny chattering noise coming from somewhere, perhaps from his own mouth. He bound himself together with his will, fused his fear and loathing into hatred, and stood up. He took 2 leaden steps forward. Behind them, the sliver of moon had drawn clear of the horizon. Before them, something like a great ape was sitting asleep, with its head between its knees. Then the wind roared in the forest. There was confusion in the darkness, and the creature lifted his head, holding toward them the ruin of a face. Ralph found himself taking giant strides among the ashes, heard other creatures crying out and leaping and dared the impossible on the dark slope. Presently the mountain was deserted, save for the 3 abandoned sticks and the thing that bowed. Remember how the wind picks up the parachute and makes it move? Chapter 8, Gift for the Darkness. Piggy looked up miserably from the dawn-pale beach to the dark mountain. "Are you sure? Really sure, I mean?" "I told you a dozen times now," said Ralph. "We saw it." "Do you think we're safe down here?" "How the hell should I know?" Ralph jerked away from him and walked a few paces along the beach. Jack was kneeling and drawing a circular pattern in the sand with his forefinger. Piggy's voice came to them, hushed. "Are you really sure? Really?" "Go up and see," said Jack contemptuously. "And good riddance." "No fear." "The beast had teeth," said Ralph, "and big black eyes." He shuddered violently. Piggy took off his 1 round of glass and polished the surface. "What are we going to do?" Ralph turned toward the platform. The conch glimmered among the trees, a white blob against the place where the sun would rise. He pushed back his mop. "I don't know." He remembered the panic flight down the mountainside. "I don't think we'd ever fight a thing that size, honestly, you know? We'd talk, but we wouldn't fight a tiger. We'd hide. Even Jack would hide." Jack still looked at the sand. "What about my hunters?" Simon came stealing out of the shadows by the shelters. Ralph ignored Jack's question. He pointed to the touch of yellow above the sea. "As long as there's light, we're brave enough. But then, and now that thing squats by the fire as though it didn't want us to be rescued." He was twisting his hands now, unconsciously. His voice rose. "So we can't have a signal fire. We're beaten." A point of gold appeared above the sea, and at once all the sky lightened. "What about my hunters?" "Boys armed with sticks?" Jack got to his feet. His face was red as he marched away. Piggy put on his 1 glass and looked at Ralph. "Now you done it. You've been rude about his hunters." "Ah, shut up." The sound of the inexpertly blown conch interrupted them, as though he were serenading the rising sun. Jack went on blowing till the shelters were astir, and the hunters crept to the platform, and the little ones whimpered, as now they so frequently did. Ralph rose obediently, and Piggy, and they went to the platform. "Talk?" said Ralph bitterly. "Talk, talk, talk." He took the conch from Jack. "This meeting," Jack interrupted him, "I called it. If you hadn't called it, I should have. You just blew the conch." "Well, isn't that calling it?" "Oh, take it. Go on, talk." Ralph thrust the conch into Jack's arms and sat down on the trunk. "I've called an assembly," said Jack, "because of a lot of things. First, you know now, we've seen the beast. We crawled up. We were only a few feet away. The beast sat up and looked at us. I don't know what it does. We don't even know what it is. The beast comes out of the sea, out of the dark. Trees. "Quiet," shouted Jack. "You listen. The beast is sitting up there, whatever it is." "Perhaps it's waiting. Hunting. Yeah, hunting." "Hunting?" said Jack. He remembered his age-old tremors in the forest. "Yeah, the beast is a hunter. Only, shut up. The next thing is that we couldn't kill it. And the next thing is that Ralph said my hunters are no good. I never said that. I got the conch. Ralph thinks you're cowards, running away from the boar and the beast, and that's not all. There was a kind of sigh on the platform as if everyone knew what was coming. Jack's voice went on, tremulous, yet determined, pushing against the uncooperative silence. He's like Piggy. He says things like Piggy. He isn't a proper chief. Jack clutched the conch. He's a coward himself. For a moment he paused and then went on. On top, when Roger and me went on, he stayed back. I went too. After. Two boys glared at each other through screens of hair. I went on too, said Ralph. Then I ran away. So did you. Call me a coward then? Jack turned to the hunters. He's not a hunter. He's never have got us meat. He isn't a perfect, and we don't know anything about him. Or isn't a prefect, and we don't know anything about him. He just gives orders and expects people to obey them for nothing. All this talk, shouted Ralph. Talk. Who wanted it? Who called the meeting? Jack turned red in the face. His chin sunk back. He glowered up under his eyebrows. All right then, he said in tones of deep meaning and menace. All right. He held the conch against his chest with one hand and stabbed the air with his index finger. Who thinks Ralph ought not to be chief? He looked expectantly at the boys ranged round, who had frozen. Under the palms, there was deadly silence. Hands up, said Jack strongly. Whoever wants Ralph not to be chief. The silence continued, breathless and heavy and full of shame. Slowly the red drained from Jack's cheeks, then came back with a painful rush. He licked his lips and turned his head at an angle so that his gaze avoided the embarrassment of linking with another's eye. How many think? His voice tailed off. The hands that held the conch shook. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly. All right then. He laid the conch with great care in the grass at his feet. The humiliating tears were running from the corner of each eye. I'm not going to play any longer. Not with you. Most of the boys were looking down now, at the grass or their feet. Jack cleared his throat again. I'm not going to be part of Ralph's lot. He looked along the right-hand logs, numbering the hunters that had been a choir. I'm going off by myself. He can catch his own pigs. Anyone who wants to hunt when I do can come too. He blundered out of the triangle toward the drop to the white sand. Jack! Jack turned and looked back at Ralph. For a moment he paused and then cried out, high-pitched, enraged, No! He leapt down from the platform and ran along the beach, paying no heed to the steady fall of his tears, and until he dived into the forest, Ralph watched him. Piggy was indignant. I've been talking, Ralph, and you just stood there like... Softly, looking at Piggy and not seeing him, Ralph spoke to himself. He'll come back. When the sun goes down, he'll come. He looked at the conch in Piggy's hand. What? Well there? Piggy gave up the attempt to rebuke Ralph. He polished his glass again and went back to his subject. We can do without Jack Merridew. There's others besides him on this island, but now we really got a beast, though I can't hardly believe it. We'll need to stay close to the platform. There'll be less need for him and his hunting, so now we can really decide on what's what. There's no help, Piggy. Nothing to be done. For a while they sat in depressed silence. Then Simon stood up and took the conch from Piggy, who was so astonished that he remained on his feet. Piggy looked up at Simon. Simon? What is it this time? A half sound of jeering ran round the circle, and Simon shrank from it. Poor kid. I thought there might be something to do, something we... Again, the pressure of the assembly took his voice away. He sought for help and sympathy and chose Piggy. He turned half toward him, clutching the conch to his brown chest. I think we ought to climb the mountain. The circle shivered with dread. Simon broke off and turned to Piggy, who was looking at him with an expression of derisive incomprehension. What's the good of climbing up to this here beast when Ralph and the other two couldn't do nothing? Simon whispered his answer. What else is there to do? His speech made, he allowed Piggy to lift the conch out of his hands. Then he retired and sat as far away from the others as possible. Piggy was speaking now, with more assurance, and with what, if the circumstances had not been so serious, the others would have recognized his pleasure. I said we could all do without a certain person. Now I say we got to decide on what can be done. And I think I could tell you what Ralph's going to say next. The most important thing on the island is the smoke. And you can't have no smoke without a fire. Ralph made a restless movement. No, no, Piggy. We got no fire. That thing sits up there. We'll have to stay here. Piggy lifted the conch as though to add power to his next words. We got no fire on the mountain, but what's wrong with a fire down here? A fire could be built on them rocks, on the sand even. We'll make smoke just the same. That's right, smoke! By the bathing pool! The boys began to babble. Only Piggy could have the intellectual daring to suggest moving the fire from the mountain. Ooh, the intellectual daring. I say go, Piggy. So we'll have the fire down here, said Ralph. He looked about him. We can build it just here between the bathing pool and the platform. Of course, he broke off frowning, thinking the thing out, unconsciously tugging at the stub of the nail with his teeth.